A lot of people think life begins when you're born or conceived or whatever other answers they're coming up with these days. For some people, though, life actually begins the day a doctor tells them that if they don't make some serious changes in their lives, they're going to die. You see, my life began the morning of my 41st birthday in January of 2019. I stood staring in the mirror, looking back on my life after stepping on the scale and finding out I was over 400 pounds for the second time in my life. You know, my dad died when I was 17. So my choice was plain to see in front of me. Either I take charge of my health, make the necessary changes to live, or do nothing and die knowing that my daughter, being only 6 years old, would spend the majority of her life calling some other man daddy. Can't you see? There's no one coming to save me in this moment. It was me who had to become the hero in my story. You know, we live in a world that has a system in place to remove all accountability from every decision we ever make. Taking accountability and fixing the problem is painful. It's like a journey through the pit of hell while feeling the pain of every lost soul that resides there. But in the end, the journey becomes the foundation of your testimony. My fight has become my calling. So if you're out there struggling and you hear the sound of my voice, I'm telling you that your story is not over. As long as you have breath in your lungs, there is still time. But it's your fight, your story, your moment to stand up and do what heroes do. It's a long road ahead, and it sucks. And maybe you're thinking you can't do it. But I'm here to tell you that you have all the tools you need. You always have, and you always will, because you are enough. And most of all, you are worth it. Nobody is more capable than you. Yeah, Friday! Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you may be listening. Thanks for making me part of your day. This is episode 246 of the Ranting Weight Watcher podcast. Before we get started today, I want to talk to you about my favorite place to be every Saturday morning. That is the workshop run by Coach Sophie F. That is every Saturday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is a great group of people, man. They're all focus-driven on one thing, getting and accomplishing their goals. And if you need a group of people to support you in what you're trying to do, it's going to be that group. I'm just telling you like it is. I didn't know them when I first started all this journey, and I can't imagine my life not knowing them now. It just becomes this bonding thing between everybody. You want to see how they're doing week after week. Listen, if you need that kind of support, if you need some place to be, if you have no place to be at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, then Coach Sophie F., 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, virtual workshop, that is where you want to be. Now, enough of that. Let's get into this! Journey updates. Okay, work stats for this week is going to be August 10th, 2025 through August 16th, 2025. Total steps taken in that time period is 78,270 steps. That is an average steps per day of 11,181 steps. 33 miles walked in that time. That's an average miles per day of 4 3/4 miles per day. I weighed in on August 16th, 2025 at 210 pounds. This is a 3.2 pound loss. Total loss since January 2019 is 185.6 pounds. Total pounds remaining to get to 200-pound goal is 14.4 pounds. You know, when I stepped on the scale on Saturday morning, in my head, I didn't feel any different, right? There was no world where I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely lost weight this week. It just wasn't in my head. If anything, I was thinking it's going to go up a little or stay the same. Just based on how I felt in my clothes and stuff like that. When I saw that not only was it not a gain and not staying the same, that it was a loss, and it was a pretty big loss at that, 3.2 pounds. I had to stop for a minute because when I looked at the total loss, 185.6 pounds, it was the last number that defined me as a failure, was gone. I don't know if you're like me, and I've actually told the stories. If you go through the old episodes, I've told all these stories, and I told them as I passed the numbers. But there are numbers in my life that make me feel like, or that made me feel like a failure. And each one of those numbers ended up being surpassed in order to get to this point. Now, the first number in the numbers that defined me as a failure was the number 460. And that was my largest weight. That just defines me as just a failure at life. I couldn't handle life enough to have a normal relationship with food that would enable me to be like any other man or whatever for that case. So 460 defined me as a failure. I had gastric bypass surgery. At the time of my surgery, there was definitely a stigma around the surgery at that time. Number one was the surgery was dangerous. And there were just many other things. Not unlike what people are being condemned for on the GLP-1 shot now. That they're cheating the system, all kinds of things. The gastric bypass surgery had those same stigmas, but they didn't hold as much. And I think that's because of how dangerous it seemed to be. That if you did one thing wrong, you can kill yourself, essentially. If the surgeon did one thing wrong, you'd be dead on the table. And I'm sure there are plenty of deaths in regards to bariatric surgery since its inception. But the number 460 defined me as a failure. I got the gastric bypass surgery in 2004, and in 1 year went from 460 to 277 pounds. It was at this point that I got extremely stupid extremely fast. Anyone who goes from 460 pounds to 277 pounds wouldn't understand the transformation of your life at that point. And to undergo it in such a short period of time, it is even more ludicrous. Essentially, I had no real life. Outside of going out to the movies, going out to eat, going anywhere where I could go from my car to someplace to sit, go from the someplace to sit to my car. That's literally, when you're 460 pounds, that's the kind of life you're living. How quickly can I get to the point where I'm sitting? Because how long could you stay on your feet at that size? Right? But that was my life. But when all of a sudden, a year later, I'm 277 pounds, my life completely changed. I was in my 20s at this point. I never had a girlfriend, never had anything, no social life really whatsoever. I mean, I had friends, don't get me wrong. But there was no real like dating life or anything like that. I had no confidence for that. And basically whatever I didn't have is my own fault. I talked about all this over however many years on this podcast. But all of a sudden having that kind of life and then having basically a completely opposite life where people, like there's the energy is there to go out and do things. And there are people there that, and maybe some attention that I never received before, all kinds of things that were going on at the time. But I got very stupid very quickly. And I was living life off of the success of the past, assuming that it was under my work that got me to that point. That the surgery had literally nothing to do with the amount of results I created in such a short period of time. This is the delusion I allowed myself to live under. Fast forward 15 years, the second number that defined me as a failure is 403. Because on the morning of my 41st birthday in January of 2019, I step on my own scale and I see that I'm 403 pounds. I'm 57 pounds away from ruining everything the surgery did for me. That was a morning that I stared at myself in the mirror and realized how much of a failure I was. That was the second number that defined me as a failure. A week later, I was in Weight Watchers, joining the program. So my birthday fell on a Saturday that year. A week later, I was in Weight Watchers. Maybe it fell on a Friday. I don't remember exactly. But I celebrated it on the Saturday. So when I stepped into Weight Watchers on January 12th, 2019, the Saturday before that is the Saturday I was celebrating my birthday, is the Saturday that I stared at myself. And you know how I'm always calling it the mirror of truth? That is, when you're faced the accountability fairy, that was my moment. So I end up in Weight Watchers a week later, and I'm filling out paperwork saying I just want to lose 200 pounds and reevaluate my life. As I started to succeed, other numbers that were very significant in my life presented themselves. The next number that would present itself that really came from childhood is the number 253. This was another number that defined me as a failure. It was either 7th or 8th grade, there were these government-mandated fitness tests. I'm sure many of you who are listening had to do them yourself. Part of that was that you had to step on a scale. And everybody on the planet wanted to know how much I weighed. So when I went to step on that scale, the gym teacher said it, and it, Either it was a little extra silent because that many people wanted to know, or the teacher was a little extra loud. One of the two, or both. But clearly, the entire class, or everyone that was in the gym at that point, heard 253 pounds. This became another failure, a definition of failure in my life. When I got to 253, and I completely missed 277. Getting back to 277, because that was the lowest I had achieved with the surgery. When I got back, when I started to lose weight from 2019 on Weight Watchers, that was a number that presented itself and defined me as a failure, because that was the lowest I had reached on the gastric bypass surgery. And then the next one would be the 253 pounds that I weighed in middle school. The next one that would present itself was the number 42. And I told the story again on another episode. At the time, when I was in 6th grade, there was a very popular pair of pants that was being worn by anyone who wanted to be, in fashion. And they were called Cavaricci pants. Z Cavaricci. I wanted those pants so bad. And when my mother took me to go buy those pants in the 6th grade, we found them, but I essentially had to buy the biggest size they came in, which is the size waist 42. I didn't wear those pants very long. If I tell you, essentially a year or two later, I was 253 pounds, I didn't wear those pants very long before they were too small to fit. So the number 42, once I got below that, that was eliminating another number that defined me as a failure. There was one more number that defined me as a failure. And that was the number 183. That number was the total amount of weight lost from the surgery. 183 pounds. I briefly got to that point before Christmas, maybe even before that, like around the end of summer, Labor Day area of 2024. So essentially a year ago, somewhere between the end of August and October, I got to the point where I had lost 183 pounds. But it was exactly. I didn't go further, didn't go beyond it, and immediately I started gaining weight after that. Now you add to that, the holidays came, I gained more weight. So here I am. Last week when I stepped on the scale, it was 183 point whatever. So I wasn't exactly 183.2. 183.2, I want to say. I believe. But that's where I was. I was still above it. When I stepped on the scale on Saturday morning, I realized that I finally had removed the last thing that defined me as a failure. And when I tell you that these numbers defined me as a failure, you might think right away in your head, no, you're not a failure. How can you say this about yourself? Look, everybody is thinking the worst of themselves. And I'm sure anybody who's saying that about me also condemns themselves in ways. Right? We are all our own worst critic. But it becomes, there's this whole mental process of getting to a low point and then gaining weight and then feeling embarrassed that you gained weight back. And that's what 183 represents, because it was the lowest amount I had lost before I started gaining nearly all the weight the surgery took off. It was a wonderful feeling to finally, it was relief. That's what it was. That was the only emotion I could really think was going through my mind in that moment, was relief. That finally I was beyond the 183 and it can no longer define me as a failure. And there are no other numbers ahead of me anymore. There's only one. That number that was the original goal. Lose 200 pounds and then reevaluate my life. That's the only number left in front of me, and that number defines me as success, not failure. All the other things, all of the other moments, all of the other regrets, all of the other pain, all gone. Every last one of them. I spent some time in reflection for two reasons. One, because of the numbers that define me as a failure, but then the number being so close, 14.4 pounds away from that 200-pound weight loss goal. If you would have asked me on that day, January 12th, 2019, this is your goal, but do you really think you could do it? There is nothing that I could have said in that moment with confidence. Nothing. Because the numbers that define me as a failure were still had a big voice in my mind. But those numbers, they're gone now. There's no more numbers to define me as a failure anymore. Only one number left to achieve. And then I get to reevaluate and reapproach my life after something different. And it got me thinking about how many people have I seen start? They started this journey. They started with the same attitude I had. And how few of them, so what small percentage of that number has come this far? How many of them are quitting? How many of them are long gone? There's this saying, it goes something like, most people who quit never realize how close to their goal they were when they quit. That things got the most difficult in the moments when they were the closest to their breakthrough. I believe that everything that I have gone through was for a reason. And that reason is essentially, right now, it's essentially this. It's this microphone, it's this camera, it's you watching. The reason I went through all of those things is so that I can tell my story and make you realize that there is a way. And tell you that there's hope. No matter what the circumstances, that there's always going to be hope. A few weeks ago, I told a story about David and Goliath. When I look at all of these numbers and stuff, like these stories that I told you just a few minutes ago, when I look at them all now, this far in, and I can look back on my life and kind of reflect, you could see it's a similarity to this story. Because David didn't just go from tending the sheep in the farm to going to battle Goliath. There were steps along the way in his journey that essentially prepared him. Protecting the flock from lions, from bears, from all kinds of wildlife, predators. He had to fight all these little battles that prepared him mentally and physically for the battle with Goliath. And I could look back now and I could see these numbers, these stories, all of the points of that I feel were numbers that define me as failure. All of the struggle I went through over the last 6.5 years. All of these things have come together, and essentially, if you look at each one of them, they are the lions. They are the bears, the predators of my story, preparing me to face Goliath. Every single one of them. Every single finite, even my diagnosis with the autoimmune condition was just another lion, just another bear, just another test. If I was willing to do whatever is necessary, sacrifice whatever was necessary to get to this point. How many people feel like they're ready to be their goal? Like whatever that number is. Or I'll use myself an example. I'm telling you on day one, I wanted to lose 200 pounds, reevaluate my life. That would make me 195.6. So on January 12th, if somebody snapped their fingers and made me 195.6, essentially making it so I lost 200 pounds, would I have been ready for that fight? Then, would I have been ready for Goliath? And the short answer is no. I had to go through all of the other stuff. I had to get the diagnosis. I had to learn that sacrificing, giving up foods was not only necessary, it was part of the process. Especially foods that aren't actually food. Highly addictive, highly engineered food products. I mean, for God's sake, there was a day where I was sitting here saying I can't believe it's not butter on everything. But the name itself, well, what is it? I can't believe it's not butter. That means it's not butter. But everybody in their grandmother that I knew was calling it butter. Velveeta cheese. We all used it. It's low in points. It doesn't say cheese on the box. It says cheese product. That's very specific vocabulary, probably because it's not actually cheese. All of these things had to be, I had to not only get rid of them, I had to be willing to get rid of them. So many people are held back by what they're not willing to do. They tell the world what they want. I want to lose 50 pounds. I want to lose 60 pounds. I want to lose 100 pounds. But they'll also tell you what they won't give up. It reminds me of another story. It reminds me of the Israelites. The Israelites were freed of slaves from Egypt, of slavery. And Moses was guiding them. And they were told of a promised land. They were saying, you're escaping slavery and you're going to get to the promised land. They went through enormous obstacles. Moses parted an ocean and got them across safely. That was the kind of faith that Moses had. And then began the journey. You know, there are Bible scholars and historians and all these things. And they kind of debate when the cities are mentioned in the Bible, they kind of debate where would these cities be in a modern map, because they essentially no longer exist. And so they estimate where this city was that they were leaving and where the promised land was. And these scholars tell you that essentially the journey that they were on, and since it was like on foot or on camel, you know, kind of a thing, whatever it was that they were doing, I think it was just on foot. I don't think they had cattle or anything like that. But a journey on foot to this area, based on historical facts or whatever, should have taken 11 days. If someone said to me or said to you, in 11 days, I'll get you to your goal weight, you just got to do X, Y, and Z, would you do it? In 11 days. The obvious answer is yes, I would do it. If in 11 days from now I would be 200 pounds down, I would do it, right? That's the obvious answer. But the Israelites, they didn't take 11 days. They took 40 years of wandering in the wilderness in a desert-like place looking for the promised land. They complained every step of the way. Even to the point to say we were better off as slaves. Are we not the same? You're told you can have everything you want in regards to health. And if you really want it, you'll make the sacrifices necessary to get there. And we complain every step of the way. What do you mean I got to track? Who's got time for that? Weigh and measure, and then what? I got to wash all the measuring cups? I don't have a scale. I don't want to go buy a scale. Who's got time to track and weigh and measure? Oh, I can't get out there and move. I just don't have the kind of time to get out there and move. I have a very busy life. I had to take care of people. I can't be doing all that stuff. Oh, what do you mean? What do you mean get rid of sugar? Oh, I can't do that. I can't get rid of sugar because I'll just binge eat it. We make all the rules. The Israelites encountered God in a way that I don't know I have ever, first of all, encountered God. We're talking about physical manifestation. The idea that there is so obviously a God. They didn't just find that once in this journey. They found it many times. And they still complained every step of the way. They watched the ocean part in front of them. And they complained anyway. Said they were better off as slaves in Egypt. They watched as food fell from the sky to sustain them day after day. Food provision given from God directly to sustain them. And they still complain. Still, they devised a plan to essentially overthrow Moses as the leader of the group. And go back to Egypt. That was their plan. Create a new leader, go back to being slavery. That was their plan. Because slavery was better than this. Better than encountering God on a daily basis. I'm trying not to judge the people in this story. Because if I grew up in that time and I was part of that group of people, maybe I act the exact same way. If my only example is a bunch of people who are complaining, what's to stop me from being the same? At some point, Moses leaves them temporarily. And this is where God gives him the 10 Commandments. And I believe he left essentially for like 40 days. In that time, they have decided to do things their way. And they created an idol. And they started to worship the idol. They had celebrations in the name of the idol. And I think, are we doing that? Do we do that? I say yes. Because the story tells that it was a golden calf, right? The story tells us that the idol was a golden calf. But in reality, an idol is anything you turn to in any particular moment for any particular reason. Like, you're happy and you want to celebrate? Turn to your idol. You're mad, sad, angry. You turn to your idol for comfort. Does it have to be a golden calf? I don't think so. It could be anything you use as a coping mechanism, especially one detrimental to your health. Could you not say easily that we worship food like it's an idol? Maybe I'm just talking about myself. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's not you guys. I turned to food when I was happy. I turned to food when I was sad, depressed, angry. You name the emotion, I turned to food for it. Does that not make food my idol? Am I any better than the Israelites in that moment? Moses gets back, sees the calf, sees what they're doing, destroys it. At some point in the story, and I know I'm probably messing up timelines, and I'm just telling you the story off the top of my head. But at some point in the story, there was a group of 12 people assembled, 12 spies that were sent into the promised land to to look at everything. And you got the 12 spies come back, and a bunch of them are saying, it's a scary place, we can't go, forget about it, let's just forget the whole thing and let's go back to Egypt. And then essentially there's two people who saw the world as, it's easily, we can do this. We can conquer that. We can conquer giants that are sitting on this land. And they even brought with them giant fruit and said, look at this. This is coming from the land. This is growing out of the land. It took two people to carry it. The fruit was so large. This can be ours. We can do this. They had the faith. They saw the prize. They were willing to do whatever was necessary. And the rest of the people would rather go back to slavery. They didn't see the prize. They didn't see the possibility. They were frozen in fear of facing giants. They encountered God how many times at this point? And still, they were afraid. Still, they had doubt. They watched an ocean separate in front of them. Still, they had doubt. They watched food fall from the sky. Still, they had doubt. Two people come carrying one fruit so large it takes both of them to carry it. And still, they had doubt. With the worshiping of this calf that they created, the idol that they created, and with their unwillingness to fight this fight, for their willingness to go right back into slavery, essentially God tells Moses, this generation will never see the promised land. And the children and these two spies will be the generation that sees the promised land. They wasted 40 years of their life complaining, wanting to go back into slavery. Food is falling from the sky, and they're complaining about what meat they don't have. Food is falling from the sky to fill their stomach, and they're complaining that they want meat. The ocean parted in front of them, and they're talking about going back to slavery. We're the same. God forbid any one of us. If someone like me, for every one person like me that's saying you have to be willing to make the sacrifice, there's 1,000 people saying no sacrifice necessary. Everything's on the table. You'll never see the promised land. You'll never get to it. And when I say promised land, I'm not talking about a scale number. I think you guys know me well enough by now to know that the promised land is not a scale number, even if that's your goal. The real promised land is finding or creating, building the greatest version of yourself. Because the greatest version of yourself achieves the scale goal that you have as a byproduct of becoming the greatest version of themselves. The greatest version of yourself has learned everything and knows it so fluently that maintenance of whatever number becomes effortless. The struggles that you used to have in this point in your life are no longer there. You might have completely different struggles. I'm not saying you're going to live a life without struggle. What I'm saying is there will be growth. You won't sound like a rookie on your 10th year. You won't sound like it's your first day after 15 years in the program. The one thing that separates every single one of us from the promised land is our will to do what's necessary to get there. And I think the question becomes is, how much longer? How much longer do you have to sit in the wilderness? How long do you have to wander in the desert? How long do you have to sit here and complain about doing the simplest things? How many more years do you need to do that before you realize that that's the only thing holding you back? Or do you end up like that generation? That entire generation of Israelites that watched an ocean part in front of them, that saw food fall from the sky. Do you become like that generation that never sees the promised land? They die in the wilderness. The entire generation dies in the wilderness. And their children see the promised land because they decided to have faith along with 2 spies, Jacob and Caleb. They had the faith. They saw the possibility. They saw, like me, the possibility of getting to the promised land. And they shouted to everyone and tried to tell them, we can do this. It is possible. We just have to do X, Y, and Z. That's it. It's all possible. It's all at their fingertips. And I almost feel sorry for them because they also, Jacob and Caleb, they couldn't just go on without them. They had to wait for that entire generation to pass on before they can go and take what was promised. They had to wait. They had to wait for other people. Never mind. If they told me in order for me to get to my skill goal, I had to wait for all of you. Oh man, oh man. Would I had no patience for that. None. I would have left to go into that promised land on my own. And even running around knowing I couldn't face a giant by myself. I would rather live in the promised land hiding. But something tells me that if they just left them, that they would have succeeded. Because of their faith, they would have succeeded. And I sit here week after week, hoping beyond hope that maybe this week, something I say, something penetrates to make you realize that you're holding on to the anchors that keep you right where you are. It is you who's standing in your way, not anybody else, not medical diagnoses, not genetics, none of it. You are standing in your own way because of what you are not willing to do. There's a path to the promised land for every single one of us. And for every single one of us, it might be completely different. And maybe yours is harder than mine. But it might be harder because of your unwilling nature to make the changes necessary. You'd rather sit and believe you can do it without making any changes. You'd rather sit and believe that solely because you pay a membership fee every month, that it's okay to stay right where you are and live a mediocre existence. Because it gives you something to talk about. You gotta want something like this. The greatest version of you is possible for every single one of you. And I can't say anything to force you to do it. I can only tell you it's there. I love each and every one of you. God bless you all.